Chapter 6 On the Anvil. "A dark prospect, and a long journey on 2 feet," said Kermorven, as he surveyed the evening landscape spread out before them. Below the hill crest on which they stood, the country fell away to great stretches of tangled woodland and empty plain, without sign of life or habitation. The wind howled across them unhindered. Only on the far horizon could the jagged peaks of mountains be made out, sullen and shadowed below an angry sunset. Never once, though, did he turn and look back to the hills through which they had come, and the bay that lay beyond. He had insisted that they should slip away at once, before the corsairs awoke. "Or they may try to prevent us. They might even be foolish enough to try main force," he smiled. Excuse me. He smiled. "Though I doubt if they could stand against you and I together." "But you don't think you're deserting them?" "With so much loot? The rascals are richer now than they deserve to be, through me. And by returning these women, they can buy off their outlawry and be quit, if they are wise. No, I owe them nothing, though I agree they might not see it in that fashion. So let us be gone." Thus they had hastily gathered gear and food together, and made their way out of the inlet and along the sandy shore of the bay to where its cliffs could more easily be climbed. Kermorven, as well as the single-handed sword he usually wore, bore a heavy pack that Elof guessed contained his war gear, but it seemed to slow him not at all as he bounded from rock to rock with an ease the smith's shorter limbs could not match. Through the rolling hills beyond, Kermorven kept up a punishing pace, and stopped only as the sun fell towards the distant peaks. "You see," he pointed out, "our search took us north of the marshes into the Debatable Lands, where they lie, that dark and hazy expanse. To the northeast there, already in the long mountain shadow, is the southward way you and your friend took." Elof thought of Rock, as he often did, and wondered how he had fared among his own people. What would he make of this strange character, this corsair with lordly manners? They had one thing in common, beyond doubt, and that was a kinder heart than their outward selves suggested. "We, though, must seek a quicker way north," Kermorven added, "even if it is a whit more dangerous. So we will follow the high roads that run by the coast at first, and only later turn off towards the mountains." His look grew remote, as if he strove to see further than the eye alone could reach. "I will be glad to see them again, those mountains," he sighed. "They are noble places on their lower slopes, with green woodland and many fair lakes, and the heights had great majesty. I often wished to go higher, but deemed it rash to brave the ice all alone. And now you tell me you lived there many a long year." "In a high house, and no doubt well fortified in more ways than one. But I didn't know you knew the mountains, Kermorven. You're no northerner, are you?" "Not I," he said, laughing. "But when I left my home in the Southlands a few years past, I traveled north with some merchants for a brief season. I journeyed south again along the coastways, and know something, therefore, of their broils and pitfalls, though doubt it not, they will have increased. Then it was I saw clear proof what the Eckwesh were about, and grew less blinkered than most of my kin. The little towns raided, they wounded my heart. The roof trees yet smoldering, the fields laid barren, the bones of their defenders left to the sky to mourn, and the scavenging beasts to bury. Elof nodded. Perhaps you saw Assenby, where I grew up, left so some 7 springtimes gone. I saw many such, and no one living to tell me their name. One looks much like another. Come, we have a long road ahead of us. The more we manage, the lighter the morrow. It's almost dark. So it is. But would you sleep out on a barren hillside, when there's a fine fir wood downhill, with branches to make a good shelter? I'll show you how. Come. And thus it was throughout most of the days that followed, with Kermorven very much the leader of their little party. Elof did not resent this, for the Southron knew the way well, and was moreover a practiced woodsman and accomplished trapper and hunter. Elof thought how much more comfortable such skill would have made him and Rock on their wanderings, and strove to learn from him. That first night, a few lopped fir sprays became a welcome roof against the trunk of a great tree. The art, Kermorven remarked, as he wrapped himself in his great cloak of dark green, is to make the roof steep enough to spill off rain, but not so high that the warmth of your body goes to heat a great pool of air overhead. He pillowed his head on his bundle, and muttered a curse as it clanked. Not as snug as your smithy, perhaps, but it will serve. My smithy! Suddenly, a great longing for it flooded over Elof, an overwhelming homesickness. For squalid as it was the only home he had made himself, and he missed the security and peace he had found there, even the monotony that went with it. His precious tools still hung there, if they had not been stolen. Why had it all been wrested away from him? Why should he not simply make his way back there, do what he could, serve in his way? These Duergar creatures, how human could they be, dwelling beneath the mountains? What did they live on? They had looked human enough, in their way, but strong and dangerous also, having little in common with ordinary human beings. Even the master-smith had feared them, till he had the sword. Seeking them out, a mad idea, forced on him like all the rest. He tossed and turned in a fit of resentment, hearing the pine needles whisper vague secrets beneath him. Why? And by whom? What power? What arrogance? He ground his teeth at the memory of that mocking smile, and glared at Kermorven. In the morning, that one would tell what he knew of Raven, if it had to be wrung out of him. Elof had to content himself with that. He did drowse at last, lulled by the rush of the wind in the pines overhead, and their heavy fragrance, undisturbed by the owls that came to perch on them, and the scurrying of many things among the pine needles. He woke only once, with a full moon in his face, and peeped out between the branches to see wide, white fangs flash across its disk once and vanish. He sank back into sleep and dreamed of Kara. Next day, as they marched down out of the woods and out into the heartlands, the heathlands, he found Kermorven still strangely unwilling to talk outright about the dark visitor. Somebody once told you? I was not under his eye then. And I am? Then so are you, as long as we're together. I'd better know something of him for my own protection, hadn't I? Protection? Kermorven sounded puzzled. Raven is not evil. Or, I should say, he who is called the Raven, for it is only a given name. I've heard many others. Wanderer, Hooded Man, Father of Storm, Lord of the Battlefield. I know not which, if any, is truly his own. Such a power is not so easily confined within a single name. A power? A Lord of the Ice? Did I not say there were others? Powers that defend life as the ice seeks to destroy it? Though which of the two is stronger, or whether they are equal, or whether both serve a greater power yet, no one can agree. But such powers there are, and my people have long revered them. Too long, perhaps, for they have faded into half-truth and legend, figures on walls and banners, half-remembered songs, no more. Scythana, if truly she exists, may be one, but Raven certainly is. For know, Smith, that you shod the steed of a great power that night, if you like, a god. He said as much, Elof gasped. But then, if this is as you say, and it makes my head whirl worse than the wine, he did bring me to meet you. For what purpose? Kermorven shrugged. Who can say? But purpose there was, and we are working it out with every stride we take. Do you see now why I have not cared to think too heavily about this? Every choice I make, every decision, affects our cause in many subtle ways, and not necessarily for the best. The Raven is not evil, but he does not take sides, they say. He is the defender of life in all its forms, and human life most of all. He is, or was once, a great sign among us. But I have also heard that he is yet respected, at least, by many of the Ekwesh. He walked on a long way, letting Elof digest that. And even if he does favor our cause, he may not give the help we would wish. For he is an enemy to sluggish stagnation, it is said, and favors change and growth, even at the cost of strife. He will not allow men to become dependent on him, save perhaps to balance the enmity of the ice. So he will stir their affairs about in strange and willful ways, in the guise of a trickster, as you have found. At length, Elof said, Now I come to understand much, and a wider world opens before me. But it is a confused one, and even more dangerous than I had thought it. Not merely full of ordinary and unconnected dangers, but a very battleground of forces. Small wonder the Master Smith denied me such knowledge. He who serves the ice, seeking to turn me down its paths for his own purposes. I remember nothing of such lore, even from my far childhood in Assenby. Aye, such things came to be little thought of there. Nope. Aye, such things came to be little thought of there, as the high wisdom of old slipped away, and the people's concern turned more to the harvests of soil and sea. Or that is Kermorven. Back up a moment. Aye, such things came to be little thought of there, as the high wisdom of old slipped away, and the people's concerns turned more to the harvests of soil and sea. Perhaps this secretive smithcraft of yours helped that dwindling, hoarding knowledge as its wealth, away from the common run of folk. That was one reason I never considered it more than a mere superstition, when first I met it. Now, he gestured helplessly. A wider world is open to me also, and every bit as confusing. I held the view of most educated men, Among my people, that is. Believing the powers were something remote and impersonal, guiding our affairs from afar. I held tales of their appearance in human form parables at best, and at worst, lies to the credulous. How, after all, could some airy being don a human frame, like a cloak? He seemed solid enough to me, that raven, said Elof sourly. And that damned great beast he rode. Or was everything illusion? Perhaps not, mused Kermorven. I always found tales of the powers riding from place to place, or indulging in less dignified behavior, absurd or blasphemous. But I remember reading one philosopher who purported to explain them by holding that the powers assumed human form the better to understand us and influence us, sharing the ordinary joys and pains, strengths and hindrances of our bodies, and cloaking much of their awe and might. Another held that they could only affect this material world directly by taking some solid form in it, and that form was more or less fixed, reflecting their absolute natures. You may guess I thought this feeble stuff then. But now, he shrugged eloquently. I am baffled, and that is not something I will ever readily admit. But the horse rode faster than any normal horse might, said Elof thoughtfully. Or so it seemed. And so they made their way up through the wild country, talking and disputing, marveling at each other's wholly different brand of learning. At day's end, they often found it had lightened their road, speeding them further on than they expected. In that first day, they neared the margins of the debatable lands, and at the next day's dawning, the high roads of the coast were already in sight. I have little money, said Kermorven thoughtfully. Enough, maybe, for a couple of horses, when we come to somewhere that will sell them. Might it not be better kept for food? Asked Elof. No, I think not. Speed will help us, at least for a time. If pressed, we can always sell the horses again. Or eat them, he added thoughtfully. Elof grimaced. But it was long before they found anywhere to buy food or horses, for the next small town they came to along the roads lay in ruins, and the next also, and the next. They might perhaps have found some stored food the fire had missed, but neither man could bring himself to search. It had all happened some months since, but the stench of fire and decay hung over them yet, and unburied skulls still grinned among the fireweed in the blackened fields. These towns had lain between the roads and the sea. The next, Randaby, was inland, and built around a high bluff, and it stood, after a fashion, having driven off a heavy attack with loss. But there the fugitives from the other towns had come, eating up the already scant supplies. Famine and pestilence hung over its walls, and gaunt-cheeked men and women encamped at its gates swooped down on the travelers with savage shouts the moment they were seen. Kermorven had to fell 3 to drive them off, and for all the rest of that day he was silent. Human wolves, he said at last. Poor creatures. For the last small coin in our purses, or crust in our satchels. Or even the flesh on our bones, said Elof dourly. So I read their taunts. Thus the Eqwesh drag us down to their level. And yet there's food all around them, for the hunting. But I will not risk staying to teach them the skill. He gave a wry laugh. The raven may have been kinder than you knew. There will be little enough traffic moving on the roads this year, even inland, if this is the rule. Elof nodded. I might have starved even as they do. I wish I could help them. Rid them of the Ekwesh, then, for without that, all lesser help is meaningless. They slept in trees that night, and after, to put off any pursuers. But the day after that, as the road curved well away from the sea, they came to Tensberg, another and much larger town that had not been attacked or overwhelmed by fugitives, and found that though there was little food to spare, there were horses in plenty, kept for the southern traders who had not yet come this year. They bought 2 decent mounts at small cost, and thereafter made good time northward. For a month, they rode up the high roads along the coast, seeing the northern countryside alter gradually around them. As the roads turned inland, skirting a hilly region, they entered a changing woodland. The high redwoods and bristlecone pines became fewer. Hemlocks, oaks, firs, and spruces took their place, and the smaller dawn redwoods. The undergrowth, too, grew thinner. The high sword ferns disappeared. The anemones and rose rhododendrons, with their brilliant blooms, became gradually smaller and paler, and finally all but vanished. But as the roads neared the sea once more, the woodlands themselves vanished among low hills topped with scrubby grass, and in the dunes only verbena and sea lavender showed bright. It was around the sea's margin that they saw yet more of the havoc the Ekwesh wrought among the little towns. Always by the sea, said Kermorven coldly, for the Ekwesh are not great horsemen, and have not mastered the art of fighting on horseback. You need proper stirrups for that. So they bring no horses with them, and will not roam far from their ships, lest they be cut off. Elof looked to the east, where rolling hills rich with grass and little patches of woodland stretched away into the dim distance. This was the country he had grown up in. He could not be so very far south of Assenby here. Yet it felt not in the least like home. So, the inland towns are safe? No, though they think they are, here and in the south. When those barbarians meet no resistance, they will surely move further and further from their ships, bring or capture horses. Oh, I have tried to tell so many men that, traders and farmers and fat little burgesses. And where has it got me? They don't want to believe. The Ekwesh are another man's problem, never theirs. But if it is the mastersmith who drives them on, then besting him... The swordsman shook his head. It may save the situation for a while, but not forever. He merely seizes his advantage, exploiting what his masters have already prepared, long before you forged that blade. Without him, the Ekwesh would simply go on as they have been doing, and sooner or later they would have struck at the south. Other, stronger forces drive their empire on, and whether it is in our or any man's hands to best them, I do not know. At length, they came to a region where high hills and deep inlets blocked the coastway, and the roads turned away inland. Here they were in much worse repair, and the going was slower. It was weeks more before the travelers reached the feet of the mountains, and high summer blazed down upon them. It was the best and safest time to venture into the mountains, but as they did not mean to go by the well-trodden roads, or stay within the usual passes, the horses would be no use. They sold them at a little town Elof remembered from his first wanderings as reasonably honest, and with the proceeds bought food. But Elof held back a few coins to treat with the town smith for metal and the use of the forge. He took 2 strong staves and shod them with metal spikes and heavy beaked heads, so well crafted that the smith suspected a plan to discredit him, and had to be persuaded otherwise at the point of Elof's blade. At least that master of mine gave me some skill in the mountains. Picks like these may save our lives on the high slopes. Kermorven cocked an eyebrow at the fuming smith. Then let us put them to the test at once. There is no safe bed for us here now in any case. The mountains must provide. They slept that night in a small wood, as they often did, a league or so above the town. But just as the moon was sinking, they were rudely awakened by a sharp scuffing at their roof of branches, and springing up, they found themselves face to muzzle with a vast bear. It sprang back at their sudden yells, and they had time to draw their swords. Moaning in anger, it reared up on its hind legs, twice as tall as Kermorven, and cuffed its huge paws at them. The swordsman grabbed his pack and drew out his mail coat, trailing it like a net ready to tangle its claws. But seeing them stand their ground, the bear ducked down with a gruff snort and went crashing off into the woods. Kermorven shivered. I thought we would be safe, as we have been till now. Most beasts will flee a sleeping man, or ignore him. Indeed, mused Elof. The smaller beasts may be savage on occasion, but the giant breed who winter in the caves rarely eat meat, even carrion. What made him so aggressive? Bears were ever fickle in their ways, shrugged Kermorven. Well, let us rebuild our shelter and take turns on watch. I will take first turn till moonset. Elof nodded, but was silent. It seemed strange to him, that attack, like the symptom of some hidden sickness in the woods. He rolled in his cloak, now cool and unwelcoming, and did his best to sleep. But all through the next days, as they climbed through the steep hillside forests, the image of illness kept coming back to him in the blighted trees, the weird phosphorescent fungus growths on the dead stumps, the huge patches of poison ivy that seemed to spring up at every turn. Vines and parasites trailed rootlets around their necks. Creepers caught their ankles. Thorns snagged their clothes and pricked their skin. Things of small moment, perhaps, but they were matched by the behavior of the beasts. More than once the travelers had to leap back as bronzen snakes struck rattling at their legs instead of slithering to escape. Kermorven, gazing up at a strange sound in a twilit tree, almost lost an eye to a great horned owl that swooped upon him and was only with difficulty thrashed away. In the heat of the noon, flies came droning down the slanting sunbeams and would not let them rest an instant. Towards evening, the bloodsuckers hung about them in a whining cloud. All usual enough in woodlands, but not in such intensity. It seemed to Elof that some change, subtle and sinister, was taking place in the woodlands he had once roamed through on the master smith's expeditions. All too often the blood-freezing yell of a hunting dagger-tooth would send them hurrying on with drawn swords. "How many of the brutes can there be?" panted Kermorven. "So many in this small area would surely strip it of game in a week. Or is one persistent animal hunting us?" Elof shrugged. They slept in a tree that night, lashing themselves to the boughs with the morse-hide ropes they had brought from the ship. Elof lay awake long on his perch, though it was not too uncomfortable, staring up at the pale glimmer over the mountains at the edge of the night. He thought of the pent-up power it reflected. Was the spreading sickness, the new hostility of the wood, yet another kind of reflection? A chill breeze crept through his cloak. He shivered and looked away. But before he was wholly asleep, he heard a soft pattering on the leaves over his head, and great round drops came trickling down onto his face. He groaned, but there was no risking a shelter on the ground now. He would have to suffer the rain where he was. The lower woodlands were hard enough to endure, but as they neared the higher slopes, worse was to come. They had long since exhausted the food they carried, and it was chiefly Kermorvan's skill at trapping that kept them alive. They could find little enough game to hunt. "I almost wish that Daggertooth would come after us now," muttered Elof, worrying at the flesh of a small shrew thing. "We might see what his steaks taste like." "He could hardly be any tougher," agreed Kermorvan, thrusting his portion back over the little fire to cook further. Then he sprang to his feet, overturning the meat, stamped the flames to embers, and whipped out his sword. "Oh, Yama," he whispered. "What moves?" Faintly, Elof heard it at first. A low, soft crackle. The sudden burst of a dead branch on the forest floor. Bushes rustling as they were thrust aside. Something was moving indeed in the twilight. Something slow but heavy. And yet, there seemed to be no rhythm in the sound, no separate footfalls. "It's slithering," he whispered. "Aye," muttered Kermorvan, and then suddenly he thrust himself sideways into Elof, slamming them both into the weeds behind the bole of a great tree. "Climb," he hissed, and sprang for a lower branch, while Elof was still trying to collect his wits. Kermorvan saw him stagger up, and swung back down to reach out a hand, just in time. There was a sudden, loud smashing in the bushes, and with a rush, something huge came sliding and slithering into the little ring of bushes. Gasping, they hung there in the tree, Elof slung precariously between the branch and Kermorvan's hand. From where they were, they could not see what had come at them, until there was a loud, rasping sniff, and it moved forward. Then a great dark flank slid into view. It rested on the ground like a serpent, but it was larger by far than any serpent they had ever seen, and a short, stubby leg protruded from it. A long clawed foot crunched down on the embers of their fire, and there was another loud sniffing sound, a rustle as of scaly skin, a waft of putrid, musky stench. Elof's blood ran cold, but his curiosity, as ever, overran it. Detaching himself from Kermorvan's unwavering grip, he leaned forward, trying to make out what manner of beast it could be. But unfortunately, perhaps, it was facing away from them, and he saw only a thick hind leg, some 12 feet behind the foreleg. Just in front of it lay their packs, with so many things they could not spare. Elof swung down on the branch and hung an instant by his hands. Then he swung back, kicked forward, and dropped light as a feather on a bare patch of pine needles, muffling his footfall. He bent, scooped up the packs, praying Kermorvan's would not clank again, and flung himself into the weeds as the dark flank heaved and the leg thrust out. But the thing had not noticed him. In another wave of stench, it slithered slowly forward, almost rowing itself along with its short legs, and went snaking off downhill. But it was a long time after the sound died before either man dared move. Kermorvan swung himself down nimbly. "Karis, that was bravely done, my smith. What in the world was it?" "Don't look at me for an answer. A dragon, perhaps?" "I think not. I remember dragons on old tapestries in our house, made by people who knew them only too well, and none looked like that. Besides, that seemed a very beast, a stupid one, and dragons are said to be something more. It moved like a wall lizard, a quick rush, then rest." "A lizard halfway to a snake, then, and as big around as a horse. I have never seen or heard of anything such in these woods." "Then I'll wager it's something off the ice. Some beast let loose to wreak havoc on its vanguard. Ah, the foulness of it. Let's be far from here, for our dinner's ended for tonight." There were other encounters before they left the woods, though none so close or fearful. Once, as they made ready to sleep, they saw something dimly phosphorescent go hopping along between the tree trunks below, and where it went, even the faint night murmurs fell silent. And later, as they were casting about for a way out to the slopes above, something came crashing and blundering across the path they had taken, away downhill. They could not see it, but from the threshing of the bushes it might be a man, if a very clumsy one. Neither curious enough to linger, they cut their way through onto the stony slopes with as little ado as possible. "And yet here is no refuge," said Elof, as they toiled up the rough hillside, the rock's bare bones showing between the thin coating of topsoil, scrub grass, and stunted shrubs. "For I remember this place, and we are now no more than a day or so south of the pass above the mastersmith's house. That means we take care. In clear weather he was often abroad. North of that, beyond his valley, he never took us. There the ice thrusts glaciers deep among the mountains, where those Duergar creatures left us. That lies eastward around those peaks there, about 2 days' walk. That seems as good a place as any to search." "Then we will climb to just below the snow line," said Kermorvan, "and make our way round." Before long, even the last traces of green died away beneath their feet, save for a few feeble plants in earthy crevices, and they were marching along great ridges of solid rock, or slipping and slithering across wide swaths of loose rock and scree, or scrambling up piled boulders. The wind had a bite to it now to match its howl, pressing their cloaks flat, plucking at their bags, lashing their faces till eyes grew gritty and nostrils burned. It was mustering the gray clouds like an army, piling them up in ranks around the northward peaks. Kermorvan looked up at them anxiously. He dragged out a scarf as long as his arms, and was binding it round his face when he realized Elof had none. At once he sliced it neatly on his half-drawn blade and handed over the remainder. Elof took it with a sober nod of thanks, for he could think of nothing to say. But at last, late in the second day, they rounded the peak into the lee. Wind still eddied around them, but with less force, and they took a moment to rest. Elof looked about him at the mountainside, remembering those first dazed moments of a strange freedom. There were the lakes, the woods, but no longer as friendly as they had seemed. The bleak gray light did not help. He turned away to the ridge above. Beyond there lie the glaciers. The Duergars cannot have gone that way. It must have been somewhere on this slope they vanished, or appeared to. It was dark. They had the only lanterns. Grimorvan kicked at a hefty boulder. I did not realize the ice was quite so close. That bodes ill. If they do have a door or gate here, something that could make that deep sound you heard, they will have disguised it with all their skill. Too much, perhaps, for us. But we will search, all the same. He looked up at the sky again, the mustering of the clouds. Let us hope we find it soon, for in these high places, even at this season, such a sky can mean snow. Darkness was falling as they toiled up to the ridge, weary, chill, and sick at heart. They had quartered the whole wide slope between them, and found no single boulder, no crack in the steep rock walls, no break in the scree, which seemed anything but natural. Only the very summit of the ridge remained, and it looked too bare to hide even a rat hole, scoured flat by the relentless north wind. Beyond it, too, the stark glow seemed stronger than ever against the gray clouds, and shone like a warning even on the brief mist of their breath. This too may be frozen. Kermorven, as usual, reached the rim a little ahead, and there Elof feared for him, for he saw the swordsman halt in his tracks, silhouetted against the glare, stand staring a moment, and sink very slowly to one knee. Elof sprang to catch up, and himself came reckless over the rise, and stood transfixed at the sight spread out before him. They had come to the rim of a deep valley in the mountains, a steep-walled gouge like a sword blow among the peaks. Somewhere in his dazed mind, Elof realized it must be directly opposite the Mastersmith's Valley, stemming from the far slopes of the same peak. But that side was merely barren and cold. This side was in the grip of the ice. So it was that Elof first beheld the great adversary, and he also sank down, daunted. It was a sight of awe and wonder, and what he had least of all expected, it was beautiful. So fair the marvel of it awoke coursing ice in his very veins. Far out into the distance, below him stretched the glacier, infinitely far along the widening valley between dwindling peaks, and out onto a vast expanse of softly glowing gray-white. The eastern walls of the mountains sank into it as if into a sea, overwhelmed. Here and there, as if in mockery of former majesties, a remote peak protruded, blunted and crumbling like a slighted fortress. Beyond these pathetic remnants, it stretched out into an infinite distance, so featureless that the eye strained to focus on it and blurred painfully, finding no hold or reference. Even a horizon seemed to be lacking, perhaps because there were gray clouds there to merge with it. Whatever the truth of it, the sight filled Elof with the sudden chill feeling that the whole warmly living world of earth and flowers and beasts and men and women were nothing but a very thin crust of dirt upon an infinity of cold, sterile whiteness. A smear of filth on the chill beauty of a gem, at the mercy of its slightest movement or disturbance, utterly insignificant. Even when he shifted his gaze to the high peaks above him and across the valley, seeking comfort in their strength, they seemed things of slight and temporary moment, no more a barrier than their buried kin had been. It was simply a matter of time, and the ice had already long spans of years frozen at its heart. What did man have? Then, suddenly he held his gaze, peering, questing into the gloom beyond the glow. He scrambled up, braving the wind that whipped at him, shielding his eyes with his hand till he was sure of what he saw. He turned and found Kermorven at his side. The swordsman's face was pale and stern, full of awe and wonder, but no slightest trace of fear. It was set like flint, and the gleam in his eyes as they scanned the endless distances was a challenge returned. "You saw something?" "I think so. Out across the valley, among the high peaks beyond the end of it. See? See?" Kermorven rubbed his eyes, peered, and shook his head. Then he turned back, blinking, and looked at one peak again. "I see. The faintest of orange glows." "You do indeed." Kermorven eyed him doubtfully. "It could be many things." "So it could. But do you see any more hopeful signs?" Kermorven shook his head grimly. "I do not, for this slope below us seems as empty as the rest." "Very well, let us be on our way, for it will be sore walking to bring us round all these mountains." He swung his pack back onto his shoulder and was about to set off down the slope again when Elof caught him by the arm. "Not that way," he said. "We dare not go round. I know that part of the mountains only too well. We would have to risk crossing the Mastersmith's road, and near his house." "Well then, what other way may we take?" Elof bit his lip and looked away, down into the valley far below. "There is only one. Across the ice." "What?" Kermorven clapped a hand to his sword. "I'll take my chances with your accursed master." Again, Elof held him back, this time with real force. "You fool! If he can compel the Ekwesh, could he not take you without a blow struck? And not simply slay you, but bend you to his will, and set you against all you now seek to preserve? Is that the chance you prefer?" Kermorven stood angry and irresolute, looking down the slope to the distant valley, and up towards the crest and the ice glow. It was obvious which he preferred, but he could not escape the smith's logic. "I said I would go with you," he muttered. "Do not doubt me. But will we not be risking the same, or worse, upon the ice?" "It may not be so terrible, not here at its margins," insisted Elof. "You saw as I did. Nothing moved in that valley. Nothing stirred. And it is not wide. We could easily be across in a night if we hurry." "A night," began the swordsman, gazing back down the valley again. But then he caught Elof's arm and pointed. Far below, at the very margin of the nearest patch of woodland, something was slipping through the bushes. Something big enough to make them rustle and quiver without showing itself. But then, as the bushes ended among high stones, it did emerge for an instant into the gleam of stars and ice, slipping across an open patch to take cover behind a great jagged rock. It was man-shaped, but chillingly unlike a man, huge and heavier in the shoulders and high-crowned head, with long arms that swung at its sides as it loped along. "Karis," breathed the swordsman. "Think you that's what was on our trail in the woods?" It moved in much the same fashion. But listen. A little way along the line of bushes, something else was rustling its way forward. And there were other sounds from deeper in the woods. A soft, guttural grunting. "A whole pack of them," said Elof quietly. "Well, warrior, are you still for going back that way?" "Suddenly the ice acquires a certain appeal," admitted Kermorvan dryly. "But might those things not be set to drive us onto it?" "Perhaps. But only at our last extremity, frightened, slow and unwilling. They might not expect a sudden bold dash." "I would not call 12 hours fast marching a dash, however bold. But you have the right of it, Smith. Lead on." Together they strode back up to the crest, and, as lightly and quietly as possible, began to descend the far slope. "This isn't too hard," whispered Elof. "No more is the path to the river, they say," countered Kermorvan gloomily. "One way." "Ah, save your encouragement for the ice. We'll surely need it then." Surprisingly, Kermorvan chuckled, and climbed with a lighter step thenceforward. At first sight, from high above, the distant ice had looked glass smooth and dazzling white. But as they clambered down the steep slopes, the glacier that filled the valley seemed grayer and more marked. Elof could see that in fact it was not at all smooth, only anything like white in the center. Along either edge ran great striations, almost as dark as the rock they clashed with. As they came closer, these resolved into dark, uneven ridges streaked along the surface of the ice like sediment in a frozen river. "I have heard them talked of," said Kermorvan, "and called moraines. They are made of rock and debris. The ice has ground away in its passage, freed when a little of the surface melts in warmer weather. No doubt many a proud mountain top lies before you there, and they will not make our path any easier." The moraines lay the length of the valley, but there were other, finer markings lying across the surface, cross-hatched in places and deepened by long shadows. "They look like wrinkled skin," said Elof. "Ancient skin, withered and grimy. And see, there, where the valley bends, they deepen and come together as they might at an elbow, as if the glacier were the limb of some horrible beast thing." "Those would be the crevasses, I fear," said Kermorvan. "Thicker and deeper at the elbow, as you say. Let us keep well away from there. They will be hard enough to avoid as it is." And indeed, When they at last drew near the margins of the glacier, Elof wondered if he had not led them astray. So rough did their way look, and so fearsome the moaning of the wind among the moraines. A frozen film, clear, hard, and treacherous, lay over all the lower rocks, and slippery pockets of dirty snow lay frozen between the stones. One last step from the rim, he stumbled badly, almost fell, and halted, wavering. Then, cautiously, he took his first step onto the great ice. For a moment, he thought crazily he was back in his forge, and had trodden on a hot iron coulter. The searing blaze in his worn boots was cold, not flame, but the sensation was the same, a fearful burning that mounted to his calves. He hopped with the agony, scrambled up onto some stones to find a moment's relief. But it was as if ice was touched to his bare nerves. He hesitated, gasping, desperate to spring back to the rocks. A longer time he might have stood there, perhaps to his own destruction, had Kermorven not plunged straight out among the frozen debris at the moraine's edge, without so much as breaking stride. That took away Elof's choices. He could only set his teeth in his lip and stumble after. He was startled to see Kermorven hurrying along, choosing his way carefully in the twilight, but swinging his pick-staff and bounding from stone to ice and back again with all his usual energy. It struck Elof just how bold this man was, marching out to confront a thing that had probably been a childhood bogey, and in manhood had come to embody the powers he hated. There might be tremors in his mind, but in his stride, none. Nor did he fail to turn back to help the smith when he slipped noisily down a high ridge in the uncertain dusk. By then, an hour on, numbness had dulled the pain enough to let Elof speak. "Don't you feel it?" Kermorven crouched down beside him among the debris of shattered rock. Feel what? It was obvious he did not. Elof wondered, but did not explain. Kermorven drew his cloak about him. The wind, yes, and cursedly exposed, out there in the open, with so much light around us. It might be harder going in the dark, but I would be less worried about unfriendly eyes. May those clouds come south before moonrise and blot out the stars also. But he was not to have his wish, for though the clouds mounted into immense black ramparts on the northern horizon, the wind died. The chill air fell still and silent. The sky over the valley remained open and bitterly clear, and the stars, as they came out, looked down on their warped reflections in the ice. There came a sudden shimmer in the air high overhead, as if a vast invisible curtain had been momentarily twitched across it from one horizon to the other. Kermorven, rising to his feet, gasped and ducked down, and Elof beside him. A sound grew in the silence, a faint, angry crackle at the edge of hearing. The curtain twitched again. This time, a pale, rippling flicker of reds and greens, growing ever more intense. Blues and purples shone only a second before the dark sky swallowed them. Pale yellow streaks of light arced across the darkness and diminished. A corona of cold fire, impossibly vast, rippled across the stars and shamed them. A vision of piercing splendor. "What sight is this?" breathed the Southron, shielding his eyes. "The North Lights," whispered Elof, feasting his gaze. Another streak crossed behind them. and a rain of starstones to go with them. I have seen them before, but from a distance. Never so gigantic. Never. What could it portend? Nothing that I know of, answered the smith. And yet, the master smith did once say that they might herald some meeting of forces. What more, I can't imagine. A meeting, muttered Kermorven grimly. Then let us not be caught in the middle. Half crouching, hiding from watchful eyes, they began to creep forward along the moraine until they were opposite the nearest part of the far slope. Now there is nothing for it but the open between the crevices, answered the swordsman tautly, and the longest part of our way. Come. And so they made their way across the wider open area of the glacier, striding along broad ridges, creeping across narrower ones on all fours, with deadened fingers that could barely grasp their staves. Hearing little gouts of half-solid snow fall away from under their feet and go slipping down into the deep crevasses at either side. They landed with a soft, echoing splash, suggesting that hard-edged ice awaited them down there if they fell, and not soft snow. The cold fire overhead beat down on them, setting strange, livid hues in their faces, lending shadows of faint, flickering animation that made finding their footing doubly difficult, filling the distance with sinister promises of movement. Strange forms took shape and danced among the patches of clear ice. Once Elof seemed to see Kara's face in the reflections, gazing at him in fear and warning. And later he saw Kermorven rub his eyes and mutter, "The gate, the high gate." No way among the crevasses was ever as clear as it had seemed at first, and they had to be forever spying out new ones. But these seemed always to drive them up the valley, away from the wall, and they became acutely aware that precious hours were passing. Kermorven hugged chill hands. Elof, scanning the open distances of the valley, flexed his numbed limbs and remembered all he had heard of the dangers of frostburn. All of a sudden, Kermorven came to a halt. So suddenly they almost collided, and stood peering down the valley. Then he shook his head impatiently, and was about to move on, when Elof tugged him back. "No, I see it too." With one accord they sank down in the soft snow of a low drift, and watched. A fleck of shadow seemed to detach itself from the far side of the valley, and come gliding out across the black length of moraine as smoothly as if it was a polished floor. With a slow, bobbing movement, the shadow drifted towards the clear center of the ice, gliding over the crevasses as if they were not there. It had man's shape, as an empty cloak left hanging has it, but drawn out, spider-thin and gray. Swiftly it advanced to the center and seemed to hang there, floating like a frond in a still pool, the high hood bobbing gently from side to side. Slowly it turned. The travelers ducked down, but it stopped and hung there swaying once again. It seemed to be facing southward, the valley's end and the furthest extremity of the ice. Fearing to stir under the thin cloak of snow, Elof slowly turned his head and stared into the distance. For long minutes there was nothing. Then he thought he saw a flicker of movement. It was like a shadow growing thicker, darker, coagulating into solid form. His scalp prickled. He was seeing something take shape there, out of the empty air. A figure forming on the ice, where an instant before there was nothing. It was there now, coming forward. But it seemed small and clumsy, like an insect stumbling over rocks compared to the thing that hung there, not 2,000 paces distant. He risked a glance at Kermorven. He also was looking south, and grimly. If they moved on, the cloaked thing might not spy them, but the newcomer surely would. They could only wait like stones and hope to be taken for them. Slowly, awkwardly, the new figure approached with none of the other's eerie grace. It seemed shapeless, inchoate, topped with a dully gleaming carapace, like an insect's head. It took Elof a moment to see it was human, and in fact, striding over rough terrain with unusual ease. The shapelessness was a wide, dark cloak or robe, the carapace a metal headpiece, a helm. Elof choked. His heart faltered, then thundered against his ribs till it seemed the valley wall must resound as loudly. There was no mistaking that helm. Richly ornamented, mailed, masked, though little he had dreamed of the true power worked into it, of moving swiftly and unseen. And the walk he knew no less well, the sharp, measured stride that set the robes fluttering like dark pennants in the still air. Just opposite them, 200 paces at most, the figure stooped, the helm's malign eyes turning this way and that uneasily. Towering above, the hooded shape swayed patiently, waiting. Then the mail of the mask was swung back, the helm lifted in gloved hands. Dark hair that seemed frosted streamed down around wide shoulders, and Elof looked once more on the pale, proud features of his former master. Again, the mastersmith glanced from side to side, as if he felt burning eyes upon him. But then he looked up, straight into the smoke-dark shadow of that swaying hood. He gazed a moment, and then, very solemnly, he bowed. A flash overhead, sudden and startling, tore Elof's gaze away. The starstones were raining thicker and faster now, darting through the paths of the stars like mocking children, streaking the night with orange and red until they rivaled the lights. But then these also blazed out, with a power that charged the air till it crackled like a forest fire, and the travelers felt the hair lift and bristle on their heads. Behind the lights, the stars seemed to leap and dance in the distorted air, bent into a mighty corona with its heart among the lights. They rippled once, twice, 3 times, even more violently. And then it was as if they folded in on themselves and became solid, like a mantle falling to earth. A great cone of bright radiance hung in the air above the heart of the ice, pulsating like a heart, and the man and man shape alike turned to face it. Within that mantle a form took shape, stately, cloud tall, pale as pearl, thin as smoke, its own light shining through it. A woman's shape, unclad, arms outstretched, and long hair streaming out behind her, as if in some unfelt wind. Slowly, solemnly, the gray hood inclined, but the man bowed deeper, till he sank down upon his knees, and forward still, till, arms outthrust, his forehead rested in abject adoration upon the glittering ice. Now, hissed Kermorven, for the eyes were turned away. Now, for your life! He swept out his sword, then gasped in horror as green phosphorescence leaped and wavered on its point and trickled crackling down the blade. A mighty gust of panic surged through Elof. He seized the glaring sword blade and quenched the balefire under his clenched fingers. Kermorven slammed it back in its scabbard, and they turned to run. Down the drift they slithered, crouching like apes to stay in the scant cover, bounding along on their staves, stumbling and falling into deeper patches of snow, never caring for the crevasses that gaped hungry on every flank. Neither dared look back, but ran and ran till every breath came like fire in a raw throat, and their limbs were knotted with pain. Once they went slipping and sliding away down into one of the crevasses, but the snow they carried before them broke their fall. They scrambled up and went stumbling on in the shelter of its high walls. Climbing out at the end was less easy. They had to hack steps in an overhanging wall, but when they managed it, and lay gasping on the brink, the radiance at the heart of the ice lay far behind them, no more now than a cool, distant glare through which no detail could be seen. At length, the two travelers picked themselves up, shaking and trembling, and without a word they turned and went trudging off towards the dark lines of the moraines. Every now and again, Kermorven would turn and look back to be sure nothing was on their trail, but only once, as they crested a heaped moraine, did he clutch Elof's arm and point. They threw themselves down in the snow. A long shadow wavered across the glacier, but the figure that cast it against the nexarious light was small, striding away southward once again. It seemed to Elof that his head was bare, though it was too far to be sure. When they looked back once again, he had not vanished. Shrunken by distance, a tiny figure still labored on across the rubble of the glacier. "Your late master, I presume?" inquired Kermorven sardonically, though there was a catch in his voice. "I wonder why he does not use the helm once more." Elof shrugged and walked onward. The way was less far than it seemed, for the moraines on the glacier's northern flank were closer together than on the south, and lower. They crossed them easily in an hour or two, and were glad of their shelter. A wind was rising now, and when they looked up at the sky, the stars were still, and vanishing behind the clouds' swift onrush. Beneath them, the ice glittered empty and lifeless once more. At long last the day dawned, though bleak and gray, with no sun visible. Kermorven shook his head like a man awakening from a dream. Ahead of them now the peaks rose, and even their stern barrenness seemed more wholesome than the ice. Only 2 hours after dawn they stepped off it as they might off a ship. When his foot left its surface, the cold fire drained at once from Elof's legs. So immediately he all but staggered and fell with the relief. Only a chill, normal and endurable, remained. Kermorven again seemed to sense nothing unusual. Instead, he was gazing up the clouds and sniffing the air. "Snow indeed," he muttered, "when it cannot shield us any longer, and we have no way but to climb. Elof, my smith, pray that we may find your mysterious light soon, or it may be the death of us. Come, The wind moaned around them as they climbed the valley wall. It was steeper here than on the south side. They had to keep their arms free to climb, so their cloaks could not protect them against the biting wind. The rock, though hard, was cracked in many places by the bitter cold of the ice, and more than once what seemed a sturdy ledge would go sliding out from under their probing feet and rattle away in a shower of little stones to crash down at the rim of the glacier. "And reveal where we are, if any follow," grunted Kermorven. "But at least the slope seems to be growing gentler. Here comes the snow." The first few flakes were indeed swirling around them, and more came streaming down along the wind, striking the cliff on either side and swirling in their faces as they toiled on up, and came at last to a long slope leading up the peak they sought. Soon the snow was lying in their path, great fat flakes that melted only at the edges, that fused together into hard ice underfoot, coating the stone like glass. Elof had to take care not to tread in Kermorven's steps. By the time they came on an easier part of the slope, it was already deep in snow. Their boots picked it up as a hard shell and grew heavy, so they must needs break away with the staves. "If this gets any thicker, we may miss our way," said Kermorven anxiously. "And in the mountains, that is deadly. But we are not so far below where you saw that light now. The clearest way up would be to follow this rock wall here." He touched it and pulled away his hand with a cry of surprise. "It's warm. At least warmer than it should be. And see, at the top there, those cracks like great vents, and smoke is rising. Earth fires." He slammed his staff down furiously. "So that is what the glow must have been. Nothing would live underground where the fires are strong. We have doomed ourselves, and for nothing." "Do not be so sure," said Elof sharply, though he too felt a cold qualm of doubt. The mastersmith's house was built over just such a place, and harnessed the fires for the forge. Might not the Duergar do the same? Kermorven started to shake his head, shrugged, and picked up his staff. A curtain of gusting snow swept down the slope, piling what had already fallen into deeper drifts. "It makes no odds," he shouted over the sudden roar of wind. "We may as well die looking." A huge shadow reared up in the snow. A vast arm outthrust clutched at his throat. It was as sudden as that, and he was hurled spinning against the rock. But Elof had time to duck, and the thing went blundering past him, towards the cliff. Rock splintered and fell away, and there was a bellowing yell of pain and rage. Elof bent down, grabbed Kermorven, and dragged him away from the wall and a little way up the slope. He lay gasping. Elof stood over him, drew his sword, and hefted his pick in his left hand. But after only a moment, Kermorven was struggling and cursing back to his feet. "What was that?" he demanded, fumbling with his scabbard. "A snow troll, I think," said Elof tautly. "Though I've never seen one. Gray fur, black claws, and the size." He licked dry lips and felt the cracks in them sting. "I think it was what followed us in the forest. They go there sometimes." The snow swirled. There was another bellow and a sudden rush from behind them. Elof turned, slipped, and fell flat. A huge shadow swooped down over him, and then whipped back with a jarring shriek of rage. Something hot and stinking sprayed across Elof's jerkin, and when he scrambled up, he saw a great spatter of red in the snow, and Kermorven standing with smoking blade. "Back to back," he yelled, "and we'll hold them. Morven Morlenhall." A chorus of shrieks answered him, and dreadful shapes loomed up in the whiteness, closing in around them. Arms swept out, and Elof hewed at them. Dark blood fountained, and a huge hand fell writhing into the snow. Behind him it sounded as if an axe smote solid wood, a metallic snapping clang, and Kermorven staggered back into him as a huge body fell flat in the snow. Off balance, Elof saw a terrible face arise, a snarling, snow-encrusted mask like a fearful parody of a man's, and above it, a jagged boulder clasped in black claws. He dropped down past a leg like a gray tree trunk, and even as the stone thudded where he had been, he hewed at that monstrous calf. The thing convulsed and toppled, shrieking horribly, and he struggled up and passed his sword through its body. Then he sprang forward into blindness, to where Kermorven had stood, but was no longer. A gray heap lay sprawled there, with a sword shard glinting in its skull. Troll shapes loomed around the rock face, 3 at least, and the warrior was backed up against it. One shoulder streaked with blood, striking out with the splintered stump of his blade. Elof snatched up his pick and hurled it at the broad backs, shrieking mad words of challenge against the wind. One squealed. They turned to face him, and he scythed his sword at them two-handed, the black blade thrumming as it clove the storm blast. He took a step, and astonishingly they fell back. Again, another one loomed up, and was barged aside as once more they gave way. Then, as Kermorven came skidding down the slope, Elof sprang forward and hewed in earnest, and they turned and fled. His blade skipped slashing down the straggler's back, and a trail of shrill yelps faded into the snow. "Well fought, Smith," yelled Kermorven, "but they'll be back, and when they're over their fright. Alas, one took my sword in his thick skull." He was fumbling furiously in his pack with his wounded arm. "A dagger." "Forget it. Drop that, and come on. If they're coming back, we've got to climb. Climb, do you understand me? Those vents. Maybe we can find one that's safe. They'll be warm at least." Kermorven nodded, but clutched the pack protectively to him. Elof gave up and went hurrying up the rock face. Kermorven stayed on his heels with no apparent difficulty. Rime crusted white on their brows and around their starved faces, where it melted in their breath and sent little damp trickles down their cheeks. The wind yelled, and the snow lashed, and stung their eyes till they could hardly even see the wall they followed. But all of a sudden, a new wall was looming up in their path, and in it, dim shadows appearing and fading as gusts blew across them, the only dark things in a world lost to whiteness. Eagerly, they staggered forward into the wide mouth of the vent, feeling the stone warm indeed under their hands, until Elof collided with a rock face. "It's blocked," he called. "Try for another." "Too late," cried Kermorven. "They're out there now." A yammering cry answered him, as if in mockery. Elof ran his hands desperately over the smooth stone. Was he dreaming, or could he still feel air moving around him? Air warm as a spring breeze? Kermorven was bracing himself, clutching his absurd stump of a sword. Try and get to the next one, he said calmly, or away altogether if you can, while they're busy on me. For busy they'll be. No, madman, barked Elof. At least wait. There's something strange here. His hand slipped across an outcrop of the rock, and his fingers closed under it. It was thin, too thin, and the shape of it. He ducked down and peered through it. Warm air, stale and strangely scented, played over his face, melting the rime of his brows and hair, so he hardly knew whether it was water or tears that came trickling down. It's metal. The wall is a casting. What? See for yourself. Gridwork in the rock, sculpted to look like it, angled so cunningly you can scarce see through. Can you open it? They're coming, those out there. Here, take my sword. Give me yours. Elof ran knowing fingers over the metal, rapped it, and listened to it ring. It was beautiful, cunning work, but the weakness of such a casting was that it must look like the rock it was set in. That strange shape would create uneven points, stresses. He rapped again, and again, listening, and finally rang the sword pommel against it. Quickly, if ever, hissed Kermorven. Elof hesitated, dry-mouthed. A low, gloating cry came from the cave mouth. He jabbed the blade stump deep into a slot, and with all his great strength bore down on it in one single effort. He felt the ruined sword bend, creak beneath him. Then there was a sudden sharp clang, a glint of bright metal, and one small bar of the grid snapped and bent outwards. It was not enough. In utter desperation, he set his fingers in the gap and heaved, felt it give slightly, braced his feet against the wall, and pushed till the sinews cracked in his broad back. Kermorven spun around startled at the grinding squeal of metal against stone. Karis, a gate! But the moment his gaze turned, there was a rush and rumble at the cave mouth, and a great form blocked out the snowlight. Kermorven whirled and plunged straight at it, Elof's blade outthrust with spearing force. A bubbling yell cut off suddenly, and Kermorven fell back, freeing the sword with a vicious twist as a huge body slithered noisily down the wall. Without breaking stride, he tossed Elof the reeking blade, snatched up his bundle, and before the smith could stop him, he plunged like a diver through the narrow slot of darkness, beyond which might lie anything. There was a crash, a slithering sound, the rattle of loose rocks dropping down into emptiness. Elof groaned and dived after him, only to be caught by an iron arm beneath the door. Easy, my smith. There's a drop of some kind just beyond. Now let the mice stop their hole again, before the cats recover. Together they dug fingers into the slots and pulled, feet sliding among the rubble, until the gate, screeching and protesting, ground home against the rock. Elof wedged the runners with such chips of rock as lay around. From outside came sounds of movement, something slivering over the metal, growls and snuffles. Elof clutched the sword tight. Were the things man-wise? Would they find the broken bar? They were strong enough to slide back the gate. He felt a great weight press against it. Then a sudden ringing impact that almost overset him. But this work was made to withstand crude assaults. An agonized brute yelping trailed away, lost in the wind. he heard Kermorven chuckle in the blackness. Somebody has earned a sore toe, I'll wager. Kicking the wall like a brat over a lost treat. The swordsman shifted painfully. We have had a sore journey, you and I. Now my fine sword that came from my old home must lie and rot on the mountain. My broadsword was already broken, so now I have none, and that is a worse laming in me than this shoulder. But at least we seem to have come to the right place. Cunning work, sighed Elof gratefully, and a keen mind that saw through it. Now look around you again, my smith. Look, said Elof doubtfully, but he turned. After the noise and whirling whiteness outside, darkness and quiet seemed to press in on him like a stifling weight. But his eyes were growing accustomed. There was a faint glimmer. A pool of dim radiance spread out before him. He reached out, but Kermorven held his arm. Do you hear? Now, as soon as he turned his mind to it, he did indeed hear, and feel, for the low, slow throbbing came up through the rock under them. He thought of the wheels turning in the mastersmith's forge, and the hammers that shook the house. He realized, then, remembering the rattling stones, that the light pool was in truth an opening, a shaft into unknown depths. A steep drop, said Kermorven, scrambling forward. But see there, those regular shadows? They must be handholds, some carved in the rock, others iron rungs. We can climb down, though our ropes are lost. Should we not call down first, to herald ourselves, and let them know we come peacefully? Would they heed such a shout, or even understand it? It is said they do not care for human guests, peaceful or otherwise. We would be too vulnerable on those rungs. They might fill us with arrows and never find out their mistake. Soon enough to explain ourselves when we are on firm ground again. I take your meaning, admitted Elof. Can you climb with your shoulder as it is? Easily. It is a scratch. Though I will be happier the sooner it is washed and tended. Who knows what filth was on those claws? But let us be on our way. The shaft was steep, but far enough from the vertical to make the going quite easy. This was fortunate, for they were both more exhausted than they had realized. Their limbs trembled, and Kermorven's shoulder tired quickly. But at least the handholds are firm and well placed. No worse than a steep ladder. One can stop to rest. I had been afraid they might be too small and weak if the little people made them. They may not be as little as you seem to think, Elof warned him. I could ill judge the height of the ones I saw. They seemed, well, solid. We would do best to use them with respect. Naturally, for they are perilous to rouse, it is said. I meant more than that, Elof began, but gave up. Kermorven talked of these Duergar as things other than human. But Elof could not forget that ring of faces, strange in their features, but vibrant and alive, and wholly human in their feelings. Hopefully, he would see for himself soon enough, for they were almost at the base of the shaft now. It seemed to be widening around them, opening out into a broad and shadowy chamber with what looked like an earthen floor. A few steps, gasped Kermorven, and then you may hail to your heart's content. I am going to rest. A shrill whistle sounded. There was a flicker of movement, a sound like a great wing beating in the air before them, and Kermorven vanished. Metal clashed and jangled as if a forge roof had fallen in, and he sprawled on the chamber floor, entangled in a glittering net. Dark figures rushed in on him. Something lashed painfully around Elof's legs and tore them away from the rungs. The rung he held bent under the strain. Then his fingers were pulled free, and he dropped hard onto the floor and lay winded. A heavy net fell over him. He tore at it and found linked metal rods resisting his efforts. Harsh shouts echoed in the shaft. Strong hands seized him and coiled ropes round the net, and he was hoisted up and borne forward. Lights danced and flickered around him. Earth thumped under heavy feet, and they gave way to the hollower drumming of wooden planking. Behind it, the rush of running water. Abruptly, he was flung forward and landed with a crash in what felt like a wooden cart. He could hear Kermorven cursing weakly somewhere in front of him. Wild anger woke in Elof and drowned all his caution. He had come all this way, through wide lands, hard weathers, and the terrors of the ice, all to be netted like some wild beast, without a word spoken or question asked. Well, let them listen now. He dug his fingers into the net, bunched it into 2 huge handfuls, and tore it free against the ropes. They snapped and fell away, and he sprang to his feet, shouting, "Wait!" But then he stopped, and his mouth fell open. He stood, not in a cart, but in the center of a long boat, moored at a high wooden wharf, lined with glowing globes of light on posts richly carved. Beyond it, a street of house fronts, whose warm-lit windows glinted on the cobbled road, and all around him, the sound of a wide, rushing river. A torrent of red exploded in his head. Dazed, he fell to his knees, saw the planks rise up to meet him, and rolled over into darkness.